I'm Kyle Thompson.
I'm Wendy Liu.
And I'm Jason Prado.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this week we have guests, and for the first time ever, we have 4 people on a call, which is going to be exciting. I think we're in general we're going to talk about tech and workers' organization and open source and all sorts of cool stuff. So to kick us off, I'll start with the by now standard questions that we ask guests for both Wendy and Jason. Who are you? What are you doing here? And why are these things happening?
Hi, I'm Jason Prado. I'm a software engineer in the tech industry. I've been working as a full-time software engineer for the past decade or so. And over the past few years, I've become a volunteer with the Tech Workers Coalition, which is an organization you've talked about before on this podcast. We are working to build worker power in the tech industry.
And I'm Wendy Liu. So I used to work in the tech industry. Now I've kind of transitioned into writing, currently writing a book called Abolish Silicon Valley, which we can talk more about.
Yeah.
It's not as controversial as it sounds.
Yeah.
Good title.
It's a great title, yeah. I've seen people be really, really mad about the title, which is a mark of outstanding success, I think.
Yeah, gotta sell copies, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going to be controversial. It's going to be hot stuff when it drops. So I guess like you mentioned, the Tech Workers Coalition and like tech worker organizing stuff in general. I mean, you've both been sort of involved in that in recent times. Jason, can you speak to your experience in Tech Workers Coalition recently?
Sure. So I got involved with Tech Workers Coalition about 2 years ago, basically right after the 2016 election in America. And I live in California, where I really got started, and it's had the most active chapter so far. So I got started working on labor campaigns on my tech campus. Like, I work at one of the big tech companies. We employ thousands upon thousands of contractors and vendors to do various services on our campus. And, the people who fill these roles, that serve food, that secure our campus, that drive cars, don't really have access to the benefits of that you associate with tech workers, right? And there has been a sweep of unionization happening in these industries in the Bay Area. So as a full-time employee of a tech company, I got involved through Tech Workers Coalition, trying to build support for these union efforts and supporting workers in various like contract negotiations and union votes on campus. So I got started with TWC, and it's been kind of my main focus as this movement has grown. Yeah. Also, TWC has been in the news a little bit more lately for its role in efforts like the Google Maven organizing project, the Google Walkout, and organizing at Google around Project Dragonfly, which is a project that would enable Google to launch in China with its search engine, but it would be censored as specified by the Chinese government. And TWC has become an outspoken critic of several of these efforts, and has also lent their support to the Google Walkout, which was massively successful. Over 20,000 Google employees walked out at the same time, and that, of course, hit the news.
And I only found about TWC earlier this year. Actually, it was an article that you guys discussed in your podcast before, which Jason actually wrote, called Prospects for Organizing the Tech Industry. And I commissioned Jason to write that for Notes from Below. And I think before that, I didn't really know much about Tech Workers Coalition or what the prospects were for the tech industry. My time in working in tech was very uninspiring, I guess. And at the time, I didn't know anyone who was interested in the sort of things that Tech Workers Coalition is talking about today. I did not know that was a possibility. And so finding out that there is this group of people in the tech industry who have radical politics and who are trying to actually make the world a better place was just super inspiring. And it's been amazing to see what they've done over the last few months, especially.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has been inspiring for us as well. Sort of watching from the outside the developments. Especially with the walkout, that was really impressive. And touching on a lot of different issues, I think, that's quite inspiring as well. And just showing that political strategy in tech is possible. And I think we're probably going to get into this a little bit more later in the conversation, but, to the extent of my involvement in the tech industry over the last, say, 10, 15 years, I haven't been a worker, but I've been kind of tangentially involved in open source projects, that kind of thing. There really was this focus on engineering away problems or focusing on purely sort of legalistic solutions. And I never really felt very strongly or inspired by those kinds of efforts. And I always kind of felt like, what we really need is more organizing. And seeing this happen has been just tremendous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like I'm a sort of an external observer, really, not directly involved, but it does seem that like there seems to be momentum there. Like it's going from early efforts to organize, I guess, the sort of non-technical staff, but now the technical staff are like becoming more daring and actually like openly objecting and openly like rebelling to the projects like Maven and so on. Is that a fair read? Does it reflect your sort of experience?
Yeah, definitely the way that people are talking about these issues and trying to challenge them has changed. I think for most workers in the tech industry, there's a strong belief that the system works, right? That our leaders are the right people to be in charge, that the system that has been so good to us and helped tech workers get ahead so much must be like fair and something you should trust. So I think it's not a surprise that the same time that's proving to be not so true for so many different kinds of workers in tech is around the same time that our trust in that system is eroding, and therefore our trust that these companies are coming out with the best solutions or they're doing the right thing when it comes to working with the military or compromising with a foreign government, or handing executives who commit sexual harassment $90 million payouts. All these things are kind of colliding at the same time, and the traditional solutions or the trust that our leaders will treat us fairly is just kind of gone all at the same time.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it does feel like there's this confluence of different factors. You have the whole political realm just changing, especially in the last 2 years with Trump getting elected. And a lot of people working in the tech industry, they didn't really expect that. They didn't really think it was going to happen, and just kind of seeing this happen and seeing the role that some of these tech companies have played in it, I think that's awakened a lot of people to realizing that maybe what they do in the workplace does have larger political impacts, and that if they want to change that, they can't just just go to the ballot box and tick a box, and maybe there are other things they can do. Maybe politics is about more than just elections. And that there's actually value in treating other aspects of your life in a political lens and seeing what they can accomplish.
Yeah, there's definitely been a sort of a shattering of the illusion of the sort of the eternal present where nothing really actually matters in the political sphere. A lot of folk kind of waking up to the fact that that's not the case, and that definitely gels with my sort of experience in tech as well. Like this, as Kyle said, like this attitude of engineering away problems or just sort of trusting that the system works. It's kind of why we started the show, because that is a plainly ridiculous sort of position, right? And it's good to see that. I guess what I'm coming back to is that it is really heartening to see these kind of movements and these actions within the sort of heart of the sort of technical apparatus. Like when Google engineers are doing a walkout for these reasons, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, at the same time, I guess the other thing we have to remember is that there's still a really long way to go. And with the Google walkout, even though so many people walked out, they didn't all walk out because they wanted to unionize, right? Some of them walked out just because of peer pressure, or because, they thought sexual harassment was bad, but they didn't necessarily want to challenge some of the larger problems. Maybe this one example of sexual harassment was bad, but they don't see a problem with the hierarchy in general. And I guess the kind of what we need in the tech industry is this greater political awakening where people start to challenge more than just the most egregious examples of tech kind of the problems within tech, and instead realizing that all these systems that they see as natural should be open to question. And it's pretty funny because there's this whole ethos of disruption in the tech industry, constantly disrupting, reinventing things. But it feels like there's an inability to disrupt or reinvent or reimagine so many of these things that they take for granted, like how the tech industry works. How entrepreneurship works, how the whole concept of meritocracy and, who deserves power, who deserves to get promoted, who deserves control over what they build. And it feels like people are starting to question it, but at the same time, it's such a long way to go before that actually makes a difference.
Yeah, this movement is growing, but it's certainly very early still. And something I've learned going through this movement is that the media is very hungry for news about what is happening inside these companies and wants to support a narrative that there is either a backlash or something growing inside the tech industry. And while that's true to a degree, somehow the media just pays attention to anything involving tech workers. I think these large tech platforms are just so not transparent that any news coming out from them is blown up a lot, which is we can definitely use to our advantage, but also we need to maintain a realistic vision of how far along we are.
Right. So in that sense, do you think like the culture of the NDA and the culture of secrecy in tech has kind of blown up in the tech companies' faces to some extent because it's created more journalistic interest in the sector than might otherwise exist?
I think so, but at the same time, these tech companies are just masters of PR. They have massive PR teams that are very effective, both internal and external PR, actually. But also, the culture of secrecy is still very much alive inside these companies, right? There have been all these leaks coming from Google, but the rank and file of Google still hate leakers. There's still like a strong cultural taboo of leaking within Google that's very much enforced by leadership. It very much serves the company and the shareholders. It's pretty clear it doesn't really serve the workers and definitely doesn't really serve users and the citizens of the world.
Yeah, just to share a kind of funny story about leaking. When I was interning at Google, there was someone who got fired for leaking, and that was presented at the weekly like town hall style meeting at TGIF, where Larry and Sergey just kind of got on stage and were like, "Yeah, there's this guy who like leaked something," and it wasn't even a really big deal. It was just some details about this new product about to launch, and it wasn't controversial by any means. But then they're like, "Yeah, we found out this guy was leaking, so he's been terminated." And then I think that was Sergey saying he was terminated, and then Larry is like, "Oh, no, we mean fired." And then everybody kind of laughs as if it's like this, "Oh yeah, this guy just like lost his job for doing something really innocuous." And yeah, great. Like we're all so happy that we've like protected our company secrets. And it's not just the NDA. It's definitely just like the whole cultural aspect of this company is your family. How dare you betray it? If you're leaking, you're just, you're betraying everybody's trust in you. And then that instills this kind of subservience to what your manager says, what management is saying, and that, you feel like you don't really have agency as an individual, and that if you were to try to challenge things, then you're stepping out of line, and that you don't have the right to either leak or like express your opinion or push back against people. And that's a really difficult kind of culture to organize within, right?
You have seen that kind of blow up at Google, where the Google organizers have published open letters about sexual harassment, about Maven, and most recently a group of contractors publishing an open letter about their working conditions. So that is a big change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good. So we've been sort of circling around this idea of like both in this conversation and on the show of like going beyond these sort of like individual like molecular level objections and sort of building up to a more general transformation of the sort of technical infrastructure and logic of the society. And one of the sort of things that stands out in that sort of thing is the Lucas plan, which we've talked about a couple of times on the show, and I know you have quite a bit of interest in. So yeah, Wendy, could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I think so. The article that I'd recommend here is the Notes from Below article on the Lucas plan called "Bringing Back the Lucas Plan," and the whole idea is taking this plan from I think the like 1970s or 1980s in Lucas Aerospace, which is a company that was manufacturing a bunch of different products for defense and other things, and at the time they were shutting down and they were going to close down these factories, but the workers at these factories were saying, actually, no, like we don't want to shut down these factories. We think that our knowledge and, the plants that we have, they're useful. The thing is, instead of using them just to manufacture arms, we could repurpose them to manufacture more socially useful products. So, say like solar panels or vehicles for public transit, or really just anything that the community needed as opposed to whatever the military wanted them to build. And they drew up this plan, and they actually had the support of Tony Benn, the Labour Party at the time. And they actually like created this really radically different and imaginative plan where the workers, who are the ones on the ground floor building the products, whose labor is the source of all value, they would be the ones who decide what gets built, and they would decide it in conjunction with what the community needed. So, and that is something where, I mean, if you look at how the tech industry works now, that those two visions are just so completely opposed, because what we have now is that for most of these, especially the big tech companies, workers don't really have any input on what gets built. It's very much a top-down directive. Management decides that they want to create this new product, or they want to scrap a product, and the workers who are building it don't have really any say. And I think one way this impacts a lot of people in tech in like very visceral ways, when the product that they want, that they enjoy using, gets cut by the company, they really don't have any say. The workers don't even have any say. I was at Google when all this controversy around Google Reader was happening, and Google Reader is being shut down, and a lot of people who were software engineers at Google, they loved Google Reader, and they were like, why is this being shut down? And the people working on it were also like, yeah, we don't want this to be shut down. But then it was kind of a decision by management, just like looking at their bottom line, looking at what they wanted to support, and they were like, yeah, we're shutting this down. And there was just no real way to protest that. And I mean, that's just like one tiny example. Something like Project Maven is a much bigger example with much larger geopolitical implications, where should these tech companies be essentially arms of the U.S. military, agents of U.S. imperialism? I mean, that's something that right now is being decided by a few executives who are, spending a lot of time talking to people in the U.S. government. Is that the way things should be? Not necessarily, but it's the way we're used to. It's just like this kind of like authoritarian structure that we've been so completely accustomed to, because it's just how corporations work. It's how capitalism works. But that's something that is, I think, at the moment open to contestation, especially as workers become, more and more aware that they want to be working on something, socially useful. They want to be doing something ethical with their time, and that maybe the structures of the companies that they work in, as they exist now, aren't necessarily going to allow that.
And to date, companies have been able to have it both ways, where companies tell their employees, and when they're recruiting employees, they tell them, come work here to work on this almost humanitarian mission, right, of improving the world, giving the world this technology. But at the same time, the management of the company gets to set exactly the metrics you optimize for, which always are revenue, growth, engagement, whatever becomes ultimately a proxy for shareholder value. And I think that cracks are starting to show in that tech workers get into this field and work long hours, study outside of work, contribute to open source outside of work, because they believe in this vision that humanity is entitled to these technological products that make our lives better and add so much value to our lives. Then you go into the workplace and you're sold that line, but you also might end up, optimizing ad revenue on this one corner of a platform or something. And those two things don't really align. It takes a lot of energy on the part of the company to keep people holding these two contradictory ideas in their heads. And the more these platforms engage in projects like Maven that are just obviously not for the benefit of humanity, the more the cracks are starting to show.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's absolutely right, that this contradiction is really coming to the fore. And it's very interesting because, especially when you consider a project like Maven or Dragonfly, Silicon Valley really comes out of a military background in its inception. And there has been an interesting degree of distance established between these large tech companies and the defense sector, or just, what you might call the arms manufacturers, and in the Pentagon. It's not to say connections don't exist, they certainly do, but they're very much not conceptualized or thought of ideologically in the same way that something like Boeing is, right? It's a rather different relationship. You don't have tech companies advertising on the ads before the PBS NewsHour celebrating their connection to the military-industrial complex, right? It's a very different mode of presentation, and so it seems to me that we're at a fairly important juncture here where it could really go either way. These companies could double down on that relationship and just say, no, this is what we're about, right? What's good for Google is good for America, and what's good for America is imperialism. Or it could go a different way, and that would be a direction of more sort of worker revolt and change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think one way of seeing it is that these companies are growing up in a sense. And when these companies first came out and they really like seem to believe that they were making the world a better place, and people who work there also seem to believe it. And that worked for a while, but then as they grew up, they had to start making these choices, and that comes partly due to financial pressures as they go public, as they become more beholden to, they become big enough to the point where they have to figure out how to negotiate with governments, and especially the U.S. government. And so they've all kind of grown up to the point where they've become embedded in, the U.S. military-industrial complex, but also have to make decisions based on what their shareholders want. And, that partly explains the whole rise in contractors, this whole like two-tier employment system for mostly financial and like liability-based reasons. But what it means is that they're getting to the point where the people who work in these companies, the people who formerly maybe would have championed them and glorified them and really believed in them, they have to come to terms with what these companies are now, because maybe there's a time when things could have gone differently, but it's clear that there's something structural about the system that these companies have been embedded within that is forcing them to come out the way they are now. And then I guess the big question now is, how do we actually change that? And I don't know, I guess I just don't see a way of changing that without really reforming the structure and like looking at the kind of like the institutions that created what we see today, but also like what are the possibilities for countervailing power. And the whole tech worker thing, I mean, that angle just seems really exciting to me because it hasn't really been explored, and we're just still in like such beginning stages. And it's kind of hard to see how a few tech workers rebelling against management could actually like change the shape of the United States, like tech, military, industrial complex, whatever. But still, we don't know. And if this grows, if it gets to the point where it's actually, self-sustaining, and like if it reaches a critical mass, then it could really, really change the landscape. Because after all, these companies can't operate without these workers.
Certainly.
And so, it's easy to forget that. It's easy to forget. But no, these employees are like, if they all stop going to work, the company just doesn't really exist anymore. And so, I mean, that is something to keep in mind. If anyone listening to this is like working at a big tech company, you are important. Yes. You have a lot of power if you find Absolutely. Others who believe what you do.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of the stuff we covered in our series on Andrew Feenberg's Transforming Technology, right? Where, that like even if these companies start out as like being very idealistic about changing the world and all this humanitarian mission, like they're still embedded in a structure that has a sort of ambient logic to it, and they end up conforming to that logic. And what seems to be the answer to that big question of like, how do we actually change the structure of this, is you have to change the logic of it, change the what Feenberg calls the technical code that directs all sort of activities inside of its sphere of influence. And like these steps towards tech worker organizing are the beginnings of workers exerting control over the technical code. But to get to that point, it needs to sort of go beyond level of sort of individual grievance and of individual sort of like objections to individual projects. It has to sort of build into a much bigger industry spanning, or even beyond the sort of industry, right? Like a sort of world spanning movement of refusal to obey this logic, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the big challenge here is like making this really gigantic leap from individualizing problems to seeing them as collective problems. Because I think one really common approach among tech workers is to, experience problems in a workplace and be like, oh, okay, I guess I'll just work somewhere else. Right, and then if they have that option, they'll just quit. And it's actually a pretty common response to tech worker organizing. You have a lot of people who are like, why do these people bother doing a walkout? Why are they, social justice activists? Why don't they just quit and work somewhere else? And that's something that's like, it's not specific to tech. Like that's just kind of the political age that we're in. This whole like neoliberal idea, we're all entrepreneurs of the self. We all should be homo economicus and like maximizing things for ourselves. And that is such a huge ideological barrier to any sort of collective action. And I think that's something that is also very heavily entwined with the whole entrepreneurial mythos in tech, where, because there are some people who have actually made it big, who have on their own or with a small team managed to just become fabulously rich in just a short amount of time. It feels like a lot of people in the tech industry could. It feels like it's an option for so many people. And so as a result, it's kind of hard to see yourself as a worker. It's so much easier to just be like, I'm working on this for now, but eventually I'll just become super rich. So even if I don't like my workplace, this is just temporary. And then one day, I'll be an entrepreneur and I'll have like total freedom. And so rather than, collectively trying to get some sort of control over your work now, you think of it as something that you should just bear for a few years, and then eventually you'll have freedom on your own as an individual, even if it means leaving everybody else behind.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But that is the kind of consciousness we're going to have to grow, because these tech platforms are not going anywhere. They're interwoven throughout our entire lives now. They're massively powerful. There's trillions of dollars of institutions backing up their power, and they're not going to change their logic of their own accord, right? It's going to actually have to come from below. There isn't really another alternative here. And you start to see like slight inklings of this. The Google walkout organizers published their list of demands, and one of the demands was actually a worker representative on the board of directors, which is just the tiniest step towards trying to gain structural power for workers within the tech industry.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and talking about the necessity of action from below, it is also important to note the extent to which these large tech companies have become enormously powerful lobbyists. So if you think about state intervention in these companies, it's probably not going to happen because they're buying so many politicians. So like really at the point of production seems like a far more useful place to intervene than, say, trying to make some kind of legal reform at this point, at least to me.
That kind of depends where. The problem is in the U.S. for sure right now. Like things are looking really bleak. The two main parties. It's real. There are very few people who are willing to challenge them, and some of the new incumbents. Like some of the new challengers, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? Like that's really promising. But at the same time, these people are so marginal. The establishment Democratic Party hates them, and the Republican Party obviously is not going to offer any sort of meaningful challenge. In the UK, it's a little bit different, just because the Labour Party has said that they do want to actually tackle the tech giants. The big problem with the Labour Party is that they're in opposition right now, and so many forces are weighted against them, and there's a lot of internal opposition to the leadership, which means they have a long way to climb as well. But at the same time, I mean, there are the inklings of discussion around policy. In the EU, there are some cities actually that have embarked upon this whole rebel city initiative, where Barcelona is probably the best example, where they're doing their best to actually shut out tech companies, and instead of letting tech companies privatize data in exchange for providing services, they are providing public alternatives or forcing these tech companies to disclose their data. And so there are definitely opportunities to rebel from a political policy angle. At the same time, they're very limited, and it's not entirely clear if any of this will pan out, especially if we see what happens in the 2020 elections. What's going to happen, no one really knows at this point, and dealing with tech companies is probably just really far off.
That Rebel City thing, though, is a pretty incredible turnaround from the sort of neo-feudal smart city stuff that was circulating, and is still circulating in the last half decade or so. The cities clamoring to hand over surveillance of their streets and infrastructure to Google or whatever in exchange for, I don't know, shiny bikes on corners or whatever.
Yeah, and it has been quite promising to see the extent of opposition that Amazon has faced in New York and New Jersey. That's been within America quite a promising political turn, because it does feel like the blowback has been significant enough to at least warrant a discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been heartening to see the blowback from communities. What's been really depressing is seeing, elected officials
yes.
Cuomo being I'm going to change my name to Amazon Cuomo. And it's just really, this is almost like a dystopian film that we're living in. It's just absolutely incredible.
Yes.
It's like something out of RoboCop. Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah. No joke.
Yeah. Oh, grim. So I guess one of the other sort of touch points we had was this this interview with Richard Stallman that was published in the New Left Review, which is a pretty interesting read, right? But I think you'd expressed like quite a bit of frustration at like his sort of mix of like having some decent insights and also a sort of strange disavowal of politics.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot I really liked about that interview, and so what's interesting is because it's in the New Left Review, it's a publication that has like a very very like left political history, and I would say most of the people who write in it are of like the left tradition, whereas Richard Stallman comes in and he's not of that tradition. He's kind of like he's not like political in the same sense, and he comes from like a hacker free software background, and so him being interviewed by someone for that publication was a little bit frustrating to watch, because you could tell the interviewer was trying to kind of get him to situate himself within the context that New Left Review readers would expect, like the political context, about how it fits into capitalism, how does it fit into this like larger social structure. But then for Richard Stallman, his approach is definitely more individual, and I kind of see why it is, and I'm a huge fan of what he's done so far with free software, and I'm a big free software supporter. But at the same time, I think what was missing is just like this link between what is free software, how does it work, how can it actually become more than just this like kind of refuge, this like isolated little microcosm. How can it be something that actually changes the underlying structure of how the world works? Because to me, the whole idea behind free software, it's not this small thing, right? It's actually this like huge fundamental challenge to capitalism. If you think about how intellectual property has really underpinned so much of how the world works today, and in some ways it's like the next big frontier. And Mackenzie Wark's book, A Hacker Manifesto, was like really eye-opening for me, because it talks about intellectual property as kind of like the latest stage of capitalism, where let's say you had land, and then that was like the property, that the commons that was being enclosed, and that worked for a while, and then it produced this class of people who were essentially landlords who were making rent off of land. And then going forward a bit, you have industrial capitalism, where you have people who own the means of industrial production. They own the factories, whatever, and they're making money through extracting value from that process. But then what we have today is the people who are making rent, a lot of them are doing it in the information terrain, in a way, right? So it's digital, and there's no physical property to enclose, but they're still managing to enclose it and make a ton of money. And in a way that feels really weird to us, because as consumers, if we think about how digital rights management works, it just like it feels unfair, and I think that's why like there's definitely a lot of crossover between people who like free software and people who just like don't like the idea of any sort of information being gated, because they see that the reason it's being gated, the reason access to it is being controlled and commodified, is solely for the benefit of corporations. It's solely so that a few very powerful monoliths can grow bigger. And the original free software movement definitely did have a critique of corporations, I think, and that's something that was really, really important, really heartening. And for me, I mean, that's something where even when I didn't even know what capitalism was, when no one had ever like taught me what the problem with corporations was, I was like, oh, this kind of makes sense. Yeah, like I like being able to, have music and have it for free. But of course, the problem is that to get to the point where software can be free and really information can be free is such a huge leap that requires a fundamental restructuring of society, of the political systems, of how the economy works, and that's not really something you can do without looking at the political structures as well. So in the interview, there's kind of Richard Stallman does say that he supported Bernie and that he does support like left movements more generally, but at the same time, I personally think that there needs to be stronger engagement with like political movements, in the sense of figuring out like what political parties are actually able to implement the legislative changes needed to make the vision you're fighting for reality, and not just political parties, but also like what social movements, like tech worker organizing is another avenue for this. And yeah, that's something that unfortunately wasn't really touched on in the interview. So
yeah, I think this is really the interesting point here, just to jump in that interview, it's a very long interview, like very extensive interview, and it gets a lot into Stallman's biography, right? His life story and his political engagement, the context he was working in, and the reasons why he adopted the programs that he did. And I think that something that's very important, or at least stood out to me, is that he was coming out of this context of sort of political struggles at MIT, and then the sort of broader co-option of the software industry by people who are profit-seeking. And his responses that he came up with were either to engineer around the problem by creating something like GNU, or resorting to sort of clever legal tricks and then propagandizing sort of ideology related to, copyleft licenses, especially the GPL. And you might sort of wonder why he didn't go to worker organizing in those situations, because there certainly was a similar kind of management pushback and attempts to control the product of the worker that he was engaging with. But I think what's really different between his time when he was first starting out and came to these formulations that he holds very strongly, and the time that we're in now, is that there's so much less to support sort of class collaborationist ideology within the tech sector. It is more apparent the gap between the worker and capital within tech than it was at the time that Stallman was starting out. And he talks about how he was trying to organize people, and an effective way, at least in his view, for him to do that was to set most politics aside and focus on software freedom. And that way he could work with right-wingers like libertarians, he could work with centrists, he could work with leftists. They could all work together, they could all contribute something to the GNU project or to copyleft license promotion. And that certainly had a degree of effectiveness, but I think we may have some better opportunities at this point to sort of put the class collaborationism aside and speak more honestly about opposition to capitalism.
I think that one of the problems that stood out to me in the article, just kind of continuing that thought, is that Stallman begins from the sort of position of wanting to guarantee collective freedom, but his tactics are then all about guaranteeing individual freedom, like a molecular kind of, the only freedom that matters is that the individual subject has the ability to view the source or to alter the source of the program. But even when he gets into talking about big data and surveillance, it has to be apparent at that point that those problems can only be dealt with at a level higher than the individual, right? It's a frustrating mix of libertarianism, staunch libertarianism, with this kind of he's frustratingly close to getting it in so many places, and then swerves off in a very individualistic direction instead, and kind of almost makes a point of not getting at the point. You know what I mean?
To use an analogy from programming, it's a type error, right? To think that an individual hacker could go up against a 100,000 person company with billions of dollars behind it.
And what it makes me think of is it feels like in his head there's this divide between what's political and what's within the realm of being dealt with by free software and hackers. And that divide is itself this very, kind of arbitrary construct. And it feels like that's a huge weakness in this project, where if you think about what free software is capable of achieving, you need people who have free time, who are able to read source code and able to contribute to it and able to work in a community. A lot of these things rely on this kind of invisible infrastructure. You need an education system that's teaching people to code. You need a way for people to actually have spare time to write code and not just be working all the time. And so it's kind of relying on this infrastructure that's not thought about in a way that reminds me of how social reproduction under capitalism is kind of treated as this thing. It's this fundamental underpinning layer that is just discarded and not treated as actually part of the structure. And that's a little bit what the way Richard Stallman talks about politics, because he's we don't really need to worry about this as much. I just want to focus on my movement, but the movement itself, if it's going to be successful, then it needs to consider the larger aspects and the context that gives rise to it. And actually kind of going back to what you guys were saying earlier about worker organizing, there's this quote in the interview I just want to share because I thought it was really, really, really funny. And it's his time at the MIT AI lab, and the hackers are saying, we're not going to let the administrators tell us how to do things. We're going to work on what they need, but we will decide how. And we won't let them implement computer security to restrict us. And I mean, that's such a classic case of workers self-organizing. Definitely reminds me of the Lucas plan, but also just like, the whole like workers tradition. And it's such a pity that like this was kind of developed in a vacuum where, the people who talked about this, I guess, didn't have a great understanding of labor history. Not through any fault of their own necessarily, but because if they had, then they could have adopted the techniques that like workers have been using for centuries. And the whole point of like having this history to draw on is that it makes us more effective, and it gives us like the insights and the tactics that we need to actually succeed.
Yeah,
and when these ideas,
well, I just wanted to say that like it's very important to consider the context of that struggle, though. Like, if you look at Stallman's background, it's like, oh, I went to school, I wasn't doing super great, and then I fell into a job at Harvard, and then I went and I was like, oh, I was part-timing at Harvard, and then I got a job at MIT, and it's like, oh yeah, like that's just the thing you do, and it would be a similar situation for his colleagues, that the strategy of exit, which we were talking about earlier, would be so easy to take if you were one of these pioneers of computing at MIT. Like, somebody's going to want to hire you. And I feel like the situation we're in now is considerably more restrictive and stressful, and it may help to promote some collective action instead of just taking the strategy of exit.
Yeah, when these ideas of the free software movement were being developed, basically the tech landscape was that the Microsoft monopoly was on the horizon, but not yet powerful. There had never been a piece of software that 1 billion people used in the world. There were no tech giants. The platforms had not really taken hold. So in that mode, like, yes, a genius hacker actually has a lot of power up against the institutions that they interact with. Today, the best engineer at Google or something is expendable, right? Because they're just so dominant.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, it's frustrating, right? Because like Stallman's sort of ideas still have like a fair bit of purchase in amongst sort of technologists, right? But it's so kind of incoherent, right? Like it's this old Californian ideology problem, right? Where it's a sort of mishmash of ideas that don't particularly add up to much of anything. I mean, he has a line here where he says, and I'm quoting, that basically free software combines capitalist, socialist, and anarchist ideas, which is to say that it's an incoherent mess, right? Like, but like, I kind of worry because like this kind of individualism, this sort of libertarian sort of strategy of exit is still the kind of main line for a lot of free and open source software stuff. Like, you still get the whole thing of like, oh, if you don't like Chrome, you should just use Firefox. Like, you should vote with your wallet as an individual consumer. Essentially, like, it's all boiled down to individual choices. And it has to be apparent that that's not working, at this point. So we need to move beyond these ideas, but like we're still kind of anchored to this stuff in a very unsatisfying way,
And that's the logic that I think we have to change, right? The logic that we have to change is that rather than a choice of browsers, we're all entitled to a browser that doesn't spy on us. We're entitled to communication products that don't sell our data.
Yeah, and I guess realizing that the market as and like consumer choice as the most effective mechanism for creating products maybe doesn't work when you have like a few small, just like a small number of companies who are controlling how this works, and yeah, I mean, like if there ever was a time when the market and consumer choice worked for optimizing and innovation, now is clearly not the time.
Yeah, and I mean, I've seen so much of this in like the Linux community. That it's like, oh, this thing, it didn't work out, it failed, like, oh, like, Red Hat's getting bought out, oh, well, we'll just go and make a better Linux, and like, we're just going to engineer away the problem, and we're just going to exit from the problem, and like, that strategy mindset is so deeply ingrained, and it's just, it's not effective.
No,
it's just
really
not
isn't.
effective.
So I mean, like, to anchor it, I suppose by the time this episode airs, this will maybe be old news. But like, the big thing this week is that Microsoft are dropping their Edge rendering engine and adopting Chromium, and everyone's flipping out because like, oh gosh, it's going to be a Chromium monoculture. And it's like, it already fucking is, guys. Come on. Like, like how didn't they realize? Like today, it's like, oh gosh, Firefox or Gecko or whatever only has like 6% market share, and it's like, yeah, that was true yesterday as well. Like, it's you're just realizing it now. Like, I mean. And at the same time, they're still sticking to this line of, oh, you know, we should really exit from Chrome and use Firefox instead as individual consumers. It's like, that hasn't been working. It hasn't worked. It's not going to continue to work, you know. It has to be a collective, a societal sort of imposition on technology, right? Like, it has to be a change in the technical code so that it actually, like, everything works differently instead of just like picking and choosing individual components that are maybe better or worse than others. I don't know. It's frustrating that we're still stuck on that kind of angle, even though it's like very visibly not working.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Firefox specifically is that, I mean, where does Mozilla get its revenue? It's mostly Firefox partnering with Google, right? And so it's not like you boycotting Chrome is going to do any damage to Google.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Mozilla and Firefox very much feels like those sort of like remnant right-wing political parties that were kept around in state socialist countries, right? That like yeah, you exist, right? Like, you know, it was like where Angela Merkel came from, right? That was the background she came from. It was a real party, but it just existed to provide a kind of Potemkin edifice of non-monopoly, right? And like, in terms of the history of browsers, like, Google's capacity to use their access to capital, control of advertising, control of platforms, to sort of manage that transition away from Internet Explorer to Firefox and then to Chrome, like, I don't see in that history where technologists' personal opinions and consumer choices made any difference.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to face up to that reality now. Like, because like our present sort of way of thinking about this stuff isn't working, and it kind of can't work because like as we said earlier in this conversation, like, things have changed drastically. Like, I mean, the context when Stallman was coming up was wildly different than it is now. Like, it's a bit silly to kind of keep latching onto this stuff. Yeah,
I think the best evidence that this isn't working is that, in one sense, open source is one, right? The most important software that we use, the most important software that runs the internet, is all open source. So like, the internet must be democratized, right? But it certainly doesn't seem to have that we've actually democratized control over technology at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's in the interview, right, where the interviewer points out that like Linux or GNU Linux and open source stuff has dominated the web server market, but that ultimately serves businesses. Like, and then, you know, Stallman counters with, well, when you visit a website, you don't really use it. The company is using the open source software to communicate with you. But it's like, God damn it, guy, you're so close to getting it. Like, come on, complete the thought, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that touches on the whole controversy around the AGPL versus the GPL, right? Like the Affero GPL. And I remember there was this huge debate over that in the open source community that I was part of, like about a decade ago, where we were thinking, should we switch to using the AGPL? Because we were building forum software. And that's something that would have definitely fallen under the purview of the AGPL, where, you know, if anyone accessed the forum, they should have access to the source code, even if they're not like using, you know, the actual source code itself. And so at the time we decided not to go for it. But I mean, the AGPL was specifically designed to try to accommodate the fact that software was no longer really being distributed, you know, on like CDs or anything. It was instead, so much of it was available over the web, whereas the GPL had just like not really accounted for that. And I remember when I was at Google, the head of open source, Chris DeBona, at the time he sent out this like this message to everybody saying, we can't use any AGPL products. because if we do, then we would theoretically have to release potentially a bunch of our code base. And of course that was just something Google could clearly not do. And I guess what the problem with that is because so much software is run is accessed over the internet, open source and the whole idea behind the GPL, it can't really accommodate that. And you kind of need everybody to switch to AGPL, but they're not going to do that because it hurts their business models. And so you have this weird kind of impasse where there is no way to say make any website source code public. There's no way to legally require that just using the tools of free software that we have. And I think that the best example of that is when Microsoft bought GitHub a few months ago. And GitHub, the thing about GitHub is that GitHub only exists because of Git, which is this this free software program. But GitHub itself isn't free. Why not? Oh, because it's accessed via web interface, and so the code doesn't have to be released freely. But the thing is, if it was, then it maybe it wouldn't have been bought for several $1 billion. And I think that the fact that Microsoft was able to buy GitHub says a lot about the way capitalism works, the fact that free software and open source are not going to be enough to challenge that, because they're fundamentally the way they work now in the current landscape is they're not about agency. They're not about expanding. It's more about creating this little microcosm where people who want to work on this code can, and people who want to use this code can. But it's not challenging capital. And at this point, capital is the kind of force you need in this space, because if you want to buy web hosting, if you need servers, you need capital. And I mean, that kind of speaks, that's not necessarily something that was given. If you look at how the internet was developed, maybe it would have been possible if the government had sponsored an equivalent of AWS. If you had Amazon Web Services as a public service, then maybe things would be different. Maybe you wouldn't need all this capital to be able to create a service like GitHub. But that isn't the case. And so this is kind of what's created the political economic underpinnings that have created the landscape that we see today.
And you've actually seen open source projects themselves slowly become more democratized. If you look at an essential piece of internet infrastructure like LLVM, the compiler that backs a lot of other compilers that build programs on the internet, it's maintained by an open source foundation. It has a board of directors. It has a kind of a semi-democratic structure for making decisions over the long term. Whereas there's no democratic GitHub or worker controlled GitHub, of course.
Yeah, and I mean, just to sort of add on to that, look at the acquisition of Red Hat. That was the one truly successful Linux company that was actually putting solid amounts of work into developing desktop Linux. Yeah. And who knows what's going to happen now, right? What's the priorities? Who knows, right? It's this is... It's just not successful because it's entirely beholden now to what the corporate directorship wants to do with the company, and all of that open source work is now just enclosed. The degree to which it is enclosed is entirely up to the capitalists. They can leave it as much of it as they want open, and close off as much of it as they want.
And I hate to be the guy that brings up the blockchain, but this is actually a space that is kind of experimenting with these new ideas. In the blockchain community, the default is open source, and the default is kind of communal governance, because for a blockchain to be successful, the people who run nodes on it or participate on it or treat its currency as legitimate for whatever reason have to have some kind of communal agreement with each other. So you see organizations experimenting with how to run these open source projects and how to govern the communities around them and govern the blockchains themselves. And they're trying everything from the very common benevolent dictator for life method on the Ethereum blockchain to having absolutely no governance at all on other projects like Ethereum Classic and more or less Bitcoin, and then other projects where there's experiments with voting on chain or voting one's stake or voting one's mining or something. All these concepts kind of esoteric inside the blockchain space, but it's like they're starting from scratch with no understanding of all the past of the political theory, basically, right? And hacking out all out of technological wilderness, kind of.
Just to quickly go back to what you were saying about these open source foundations that are trying to compete. I think that speaks more broadly to the problem of organizations and groups without capital, or deliberately disavowing trying to accumulate capital in a socioeconomic landscape that is fundamentally tilted towards those who have capital. And so, no matter what its intentions, any open source or nonprofit that competes or is in some way useful to this larger corporate entity, they're going to find themselves potentially bought out or just killed off, and that's just kind of how it is, and that's those are just the structural dynamics at play. And so that's not really something we can fix by creating a slightly nicer organization or one slightly better bylaws, because you have to look at these larger structural imperatives. And I think that's something that maybe hackers are traditionally not keen to do, right? Because it's so nice to focus on your little project to make to create this world that you have full control over and make it as perfect as you want. But then, of course, if you do that and if you don't look at the bigger picture, then you just don't really see what's maybe coming for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it has to rise to the level of changing the structural logic that governs the whole thing. Because as you said, if you're just swimming in this sea, it's still a sea, right? You're still at risk of drowning, regardless of how successful you are. It's I don't know. I think I'm sort of feeling kind of down on the open source sort of stuff now. Well, I mean, I'm obviously still committed to the ideals, and the principles are still laudable, but I think we're definitely going through a period of retrenchment and sort of capital re-territorializing around this stuff, and just finishing off the capture that was started years ago. I think we're going to see more of these. Ubuntu is going to get bought, or Canonical or whatever, and just that retrenchment will get pretty bad. I mean, Google already dominates the entire web. That'll just be finished off, by Mozilla, Firefox dipping to 1% market share or whatever in browsers. And I mean, I can only hope that there's we still get this I hope that we people realize, techies realize that exactly what we've been talking about here, that the realm of the individual consumer choice, voting with your wallet or whatever, doesn't fucking work. You need to collectivize and basically communize Google is the solution to if Google's a colossal monopoly or Amazon's a colossal monopoly, the solution is to go in there and take their stuff and socialize it.
Yeah.
Easy.
Yeah, trivial. We can get that done. I guess, is there anything else you'd like to talk over before we sort of start wrapping up?
We could go back to something about tech worker organizing. So there's actually one thing I wanted to talk about. I guess I just would love to hear what you guys think about it. But one of the arguments I've been having with people about tech worker organizing, especially with people on the left who are kind of suspicious of tech and suspicious of tech people, and some of them are saying why do you even bother? These people are never going to fight for something that's not in their class interest. These people are too close to capital, too close to management. They have stock. They're by virtue of their position under the system, and also they're just their ideological predispositions, they're never going to fight for something that benefits that at their expense, at their own expense. And what is even the point of trying to organize tech workers? It's going to be or trying to organize cops, or just generally futile, which I strongly disagree with. But at the same time, it's kind of hard to have that discussion. And so one of the things that Jason and I have been talking about is that if you're trying to get tech workers to stand in solidarity with other people who on their campus, cleaners, security guards, cafeteria workers, there is sometimes the risk of it becoming this moralizing thing about about or guilt. And that's something where we both fundamentally disagree. We don't think it has to be about charity and guilt. Instead it is about solidarity, and about, instead of charity, it's about injustice in a way, right? And it's injustice, and also seeing that you are all on the same side. And it's almost a strategic thing, because it's useful for capital if the working class is divided. And so you kind of have to see it as this the wool that they're pulling over your eyes is that you're all different. You should all be fighting as individuals. And once you kind of realize that this myth is only benefiting the people on top, then that's when you kind of get to see that it's almost like Hunger Games as a metaphor, where you're made to compete with each other. You're made to feel like you should be fighting each other, but at the same time, who has created the arena on which you're fighting? Who is making you fight? You don't have to. There is enough. You don't need to be fighting. It's just like a spectacle for the benefit of the people on top. And so I think it's like a huge challenge trying to get people to that point where they see it that way, as opposed to just like fighting, as individuals trying to compete with each other. So, yeah.
And this touches on something I wrote about in my article, and also that TWC speaks about a lot, is who is a tech worker, right? And I think it's really important to have a very expansive definition of who a tech worker is, right?
Yes.
To the point of anyone who works for a tech platform is a tech worker, but even people who use technology in other sectors of the economy are also tech workers. And you see this in how big tech platforms are increasingly structuring their companies. We've all been talking about how most people who work at Google now don't work at Google, right? They have 120,000 contractors to their 90,000 actual employees, and that's coming for all of us, right? And I think it would be good for software engineers like me to understand that, like, we'll be the last to be kind of de-skilled or automated or whatever, but it'll come for us as well. If you look at other industries where this has happened, like, who runs Hollywood? Is it people who make cameras and like hold cameras? Like, definitely not, right? And I'm more like those people than the money people who actually control that industry. So in the long timeline, the financial forces will control all of our workplaces. So it's better to start getting organized now.
Yeah, and I think just to add on the contractor system, the whole two-tier employment system, when you read about what's happening in other industries and also labor history, it's so clear that like what's happening in Silicon Valley is just the same as what's happening everywhere. And that while it's nice to think of, tech companies as being this like refuge from capitalism and like a place where things are different, where people care about actually making the world a better place, it's not. It's subject to the same forces. There's a book, Choke Points, which is about workers resisting in the logistical sector, people who are like driving trucks, who are working on the docks and stuff like that. And like in every single one of these industries in every different country, you have the introduction of this two-tier contractor system. You have some people who are making slightly better wages, and then you have new people who are coming in and with terrible wages and conditions. And it's just so obvious that it's a force of control. It's a force of efficiency for capital. And I think once you start to realize that what's happening in tech is not unique, and not only do you understand that there's this larger system, you also see how to resist, because you can learn from people in other industries and who've resisted this in the past.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the sort of common threads there that helps to clarify thought is basically systems thinking, that pointing out that I suppose the antidote to atomization is to consider connections and assemblages, and to look at how two things that seem to be different and separate are actually linked together, and look, there's a positive feedback loop between them, this sort of stuff.
We're supposed to be good at that.
We're supposed to be, yeah, but I think that's an angle I've had some success with techies, I suppose, that sort of broadening the horizon out from the individual to consider the systemic sort of stuff. And yeah, I think that's the thing. It is a skill that thinking in terms of systems is a skill that a lot of techies have, because it's kind of hard to do the job if you don't. So that's potentially an angle to go from. On the other thing, I think that started off at the beginning of that question, though, there are people on the left who are skeptical of tech. I think I have a feeling that a lot of that is rooted in a sort of nostalgia for a time that was a bit simpler, where the means of production were simpler. And I think you cannot escape the fact that technology and communications infrastructure is the means of production at this point, So I don't know, I think there's definitely a sort of contingent of lefties who are just sort of nostalgic for the early 20th century, essentially, people in blue overalls with cartoonishly oversized wrenches slung over their shoulders and hard hats and stuff as being the workers. I was like, no, sorry, dude, it's tech people are workers too. I mean, it's the means of production.
Well, I think it speaks to, a really profound strategic failure. And I think that this attitude that tech workers are irredeemably complicit in capitalism, and they're just collaborationists, and they have all this stock, and therefore their interests are basically petty bourgeois. All of that kind of thinking like, I understand where it comes from at some level, because there are a lot of people on the left who have spent time organizing against social phenomena that tech workers have wrought, right? People trying to protect their communities from being gentrified in, these kind of like sudden unstoppable processes of tech companies coming in, bringing in people from elsewhere, and those people living in just a completely different standard of living, and what that ends up doing to the community, and sort of the communication mismatches that happen between tech workers and other workers in those communities. So, like, I understand, like, there are real histories of conflict here. There have been real material differences, but it seems to me like that assessment is equally sort of rooted in past strategic analysis to the RMS, Richard Stallman, free software approach, right? Where he was addressing a similar dynamic, but he was trying to do it from the inside and seeing what he could do within that situation, right? Like, where there was a lot of class collaborationism, where, like, there was a petty bourgeois mentality among tech workers, because, like, they were getting stocks, and, like, what was good for the company was good for them, and it was a path to becoming members of the capitalist class, possibly. Like, that was all so much more open. But, like, we always have to do a real strategic analysis of existing conditions, and not just stick to some strategy or some assessment that was valid 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? These things change.
Because if you don't do that analysis, you can end up with what is essentially a miasma theory of class, where if you are touched by the fog of capital, you're corrupted.
Like, that is so wrong. And this idea that, like, tech workers are basically cops. Well, RMS kind of gets into this a little bit in the New Left Review interview, where he does sort of point out that some of the work that tech workers do is police labor, right? There is a certain way in which tech workers are expected to use administrative privileges to control information and access in a way that is kind of similar to police work. But tech workers are not just police. Like, police are hired to do many things, but primarily what they exist to do is protect private property. And that is, like, maybe a secondary thing that tech workers do. But the tech workers do many other things as well. And I think all of us are to some degree implicated in police work if we have any kind of management responsibilities at all. Like, for example, I am a teacher. I do police work in that sense, right? I'm working for this system of meritocratic certification that is basically reproducing the class system. And when I, mark students' work and assign grades and thereby control access to privileges, I am doing a similar kind of labor that tech workers do. And nobody's saying, teachers are just cops, right? So let's have another look around,
Yeah, for sure. I think the reason that there is value in trying to organize tech workers is because their skills could be used for so much more than what they're being used for now, right? And it's like, even if, some of them are fulfilling police-like functions, that doesn't mean that's all they're capable of doing. And I'm sure that for a lot of them, they're not necessarily happy writing the sort of code, building the sort of products they are, and that if given the choice, if they had the chance and the possibility to imagine something different, they would probably choose something that they think is useful for society. And it's just like a matter of changing the structure so that becomes a possibility.
Yeah, I guess for me as well, it's like that. Yeah, that if people are pursuing this purity line where you have to be completely non-cop to be in any way left, I just have no confidence whatsoever that kind of miserableism will go anywhere. Like, I think it's a fucking dead end in terms of organizing. the beginning of changing this world is to realize that we are in fact embedded in it, and we are complicit. Like, we are complicit, and that's fine, because it is in fact a system in which we are embedded and we are agents within it.
I'm pretty optimistic about the state of tech on the left, though. As an indicator of that, when the Google buses, the big white buses that take Google workers from San Francisco down to Mountain View, when they first showed up about a decade ago, there have been protests over them since then, basically. I was on one of these private buses one time that was stopped by protesters. The tires were slashed, kind of attacked by protesters. That was several years ago. Then they've continued, but the tone of them has changed slightly. And I think the most visible one the past few months was, all these scooters that are proliferated around cities, these rental scooters that startups are littering San Francisco with. Some protesters blockaded the Google bus, threw a bunch of these scooters in front of the bus to block it, and then set some stuff on fire or something. It looked really cool. They were wearing these hazmat suits. And the message wasn't so much Google workers, you're gentrifying us, you're screwing us. It was more against Google and the leadership. And in fact, there were actually tech workers who were there and present and participating in the protest. And that's something I don't think you saw 5 to 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. No, it's good. Thanks, Wendy and Jason, for coming along with us, and thanks, listeners, for listening. If you'd like to find us on the internet, we're on Twitter at GI Unit Pod. We're on Facebook as General Intellect Unit. You can find us at generalintellectunit.net, and we're on all the podcast apps, so, like, rate, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Or if you want to support the show, head to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and kick us a couple of bucks a month to pay for books and hosting and stuff. But before we wrap up, we like to give the last word to the guests. So Wendy, anything you'd like to plug, or any sort of links you'd like to hand out?
Sorry, I didn't prepare for this.
Sure.
I don't know. Follow me on Twitter, I guess.
Okay, cool. That's at Dell System.
Yeah, Dell System.
Fabulous. And you have a book coming out sometime in the new year, maybe, is it? Or is it later in the year?
Either next year or the year after.
Okay. We'll keep up with that. We'll keep up with that when it's coming out, and we'll let listeners know. And Jason, is there anything you'd like to plug?
If you want to learn more about the Tech Workers Coalition, you can go to techworkerscoalition.org. Follow us on Twitter at TechWorkersCo. We can try and help you find other people in your workplace to organize with, and help give you some resources.
Superb. Well, I guess that's it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.